currently. 6 universities, 13 community colleges, and 27 colleges of applied technology. So we are a diverse system. In my work there, I primarily, well not primarily, I provide tools and resources to our campus equity officers and diversity officers. I came into this work when I was still on a campus. I was at a campus with a majority racial minority student population. So when I got there, I had to figure out, okay, so I'm a career diversity practitioner. I'm used to finding racial minorities and providing them services. So when I get there and everyone is a racial minority as America defines it, then who do I serve? And then from that point, I quickly found our LGBTQ student population and found out how they were grossly underserved. So ever since then, that has been my thread. That's just what I love to do. What I bring specifically to this work is because that is how I came into it. I quickly found that there were so many campuses across the country that were doing amazing things for their LGBTQ students, but it lacked a cultural lens in what it was that they were providing their students in a way that I couldn't bring it on my campus. I had to do so much customization to the existing materials in order to engage my students. All right, so just so you guys know what to expect today, we're going to really take this into 3 parts, 3 facilitators, 3 parts. That's how we're going to come at it.
3-part harmony.
Yeah, 3-part harmony. Okay, so the first part, I'm going to kind of lay the foundation to explain more of this work, kind of like that last piece of how I came into this work. That's what I'm going to hopefully help you guys to understand the necessity of putting a cultural lens on your LGBTQ programming. From there, it is my favorite part of the presentation, no shade, Henderson, but it's my favorite part of the presentation when Dwayne comes and he actually gets into pop culture to kind of give you some examples of different ways you can better engage your African American trans students. And then the last part, the brilliance of Mr. Hill here, he is going to come with some tools and resources that you can take back to your campuses and start to implement to have more racially inclusive LGBT programming or for your trans students. We had a clicker. Where is it?
I can get a clicker. Student affairs practitioners, you know, we just make it work. Make it work.
Okay, so let's start with the case, with the framework. I want to give you this case for an intersectional approach. The way I came into this, I've already shared a bit with it, but my first exposure to this work was through a Safe Zone program at one of our area institutions, one of our partner institutions. And it was an amazing program. But while I was sitting there, the facilitator, who was white, used so much racially triggering terms that it missed me. Now, me being a diversity practitioner and doing this work and having a better understanding of who I am and how my identities work together, I was able to move past it. But for your students who aren't quite at that level of understanding who they are fully, that could easily exclude them from further participation in your events. So that's why I always, whenever I talk to groups, I make the case for an intersectional approach. You can have amazing LGBTQ programming. You can have amazing, we're going to keep it trans, I'm sorry. But you can have amazing programming for your trans students. But if you are not including the racial, the cultural experiences of others, of your non-majority race, that's even more loaded, but of your minority students, then you could really be missing the mark. All right, so in that, okay, so how many in the room actually facilitate some sort of educational program for your campus on supporting LGBT students or understanding LGBT students? Something you kind of a go-to person in a way. All right, so in that, you'll know a huge part of helping the campus to understand is talking about privilege and power, specifically as it is around sexuality and gender. And it's a very necessary conversation, but I want to drop in a cautionary word here about that. I feel like it's necessary for the conversation, but even more so, it's so necessary to own your privileged identities in that moment beyond sexuality and gender. And specifically, I'm thinking about race. I'm coming from the South, I can't help it. But this is America and we have a racial problem all across the country, so I know this isn't specific to the South. But be sure that you are owning all of your privileged identities, because imagine how triggering it can be if you have a white facilitator that is teaching about power and privilege, and they're not owning their whiteness in America, and they're talking to a group of students and there are racial minority students in the room. You can imagine how triggering that could be. So necessary, but just be very cautious when you're going into it that you own all of your privileged identities in those conversations. All right, so now I'm going to give you a crash course on being Black in America. Everything that we're saying, another caveat here, everything that we're saying is based on our experiences. We do not claim to be experts on trans students. We don't claim to be experts on African American students. We are sharing our experiences in doing this work and what we've found, and hoping that you can take some of what we've learned in our experiences, and if you find it useful, use it on your own campuses. So, with that being said, we want to do a crash course. We want to talk about 4 different areas. And it's click, 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 click. Race. We're going to talk about religion, gender roles and perceptions. And lastly, we're going to talk about how where someone is in the country could impact the way that they may identify with some of the programming that you're offering on your campuses. So first, let's talk about race. Everybody in this room knows how big the Black Lives Matter movement is in this country right now. I was reading an article recently, and it was just a comparison of the civil rights movement from the 1960s. It's huge. It wasn't started by mid-30s professionals with a few degrees under their belt. These were students for the most part. So you have to understand, these are the students that you're serving on your campuses, or whoever may not already know that. These are young people. These are people that when you're developing your programming, this should be your target audience in a way, and just know that they're coming with this experience. Social media has just bust the world wide open. We can see everything going on at all times of the day. So even if your students aren't, they don't seem to be particularly engaged in your community, just understand they have access to a social media community, where they're still a part of this Black Lives Matter. So just understand that dynamic when you're interacting with your African American students. All right. So then we're going to talk, I'm going to do something different here, but we're going to talk about religion. So does anybody know who that is in that picture? Anybody? Anybody remember Tone? Mm-hmm. Make me over. Anybody remember? That's B. Slade, that's Tone, who has rebranded himself as B. Slade, right? So for those who don't know, Tone was a gospel singer, really big in early 2000s.
And it's from the Bay Area.
Is he? I just learned something.
San Diego.
He just made something up.
He's
from California. Okay. But he very publicly came out when he was in really the height of his gospel career, and then all of a sudden we don't see Tone anymore. But a few years after, I don't know how recent it's been, we see emergence of B. Slade. What I failed to do is I wanted to show a picture comparing, for those who aren't familiar with Tone. He was in a 3-piece suit. He had his,
I only got 2 pieces today.
It looks 3. I'm sorry, but he had conformed to what was acceptable in the gospel community. But when he started being his true self, this is how he emerged. So I use him as an example because the church is such a huge part of the Black community. Historically, even to this day, it is just a big part of the Black experience in here, in America, and it's still very homophobic. There are more churches that are coming out as affirming churches. There are more spaces, so it's getting better, but it's still very, very, very homophobic. And what's so tragic to me about that is you have so many LGBTQ students really on your campus who grew up in the church, and then when they started being more open about who they are and where they were in their identities, they were rejected by their church. So just know these are the people that you're serving. This is what you're encountering when you're coming across these students. All right, so it's cute. All right, so this was something that I came across in my research. I thought it was fascinating because me just being honest and just owning this moment, I didn't